Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Lucy Hodes, Senior Vice President of Media and Communications for CCA, and I will be your moderator. I hope everybody's doing well. Today's webinar is Addressing the Digital Divide, and it's sponsored by Druid. We have a very interesting roundtable discussion planned about the key drivers, challenges, use cases, and customer deployments addressing the digital divide, and we have 4 speakers. I'll first introduce Ty Kinney, who is Senior Vice President of Marketing, PR, and Business Development at Druid Software. He has helped many startups with their go-to-market strategies in B2B and B2C environments, has been instrumental in developing markets for Druid's private networks in the US. Next is David Peterson, Senior Engineer of ISP Supplies. David has been engineering advanced wireless networks since 2000, and he's been in IT since 1992. He has worked with the WISP and enterprise communities for the last 12 years, and his expertise in 4G systems brings ISP Supplies a vast knowledge base for their customers. Next is Richard Bernhardt, who is National Spectrum Advisor for the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association, or WISPA. His role includes serving as the industry and stakeholder advocate for wireless providers. He also serves on the board of the Wireless Innovation Forum and is active with the leadership of the OnGo Alliance, which is formerly the CBRS Alliance. And I'd also like to introduce Jim Jacobellis, who is VP of Partners and Business Development at Geoverse. Jim has more than 25 years experience in the industry, and in his current role, he works with technology companies to create innovative networking solutions for verticals served by the private cellular space. For those of you in the audience today, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please ask them at any time and we will get to the Q&A at the very end. Also, today's webinar is being recorded and it will be available on CCA's website after it's over. Now, Ty, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. So welcome to our roundtable session, where, as Lucy says, we're going to discuss the digital divide, which we see widening since the pandemic. So we see how people with poor or no data access are getting left behind as distance learning and work has been driven to the online world effectively. So we're going to discuss how 4G and 5G technology are addressing the challenge of closing this divide. We've got some great discussion points for the panel in this session. We're going to explore what some of the key drivers are behind the use of LTE 4G using OnGo, like the need to close this widening digital divide. We're going to take a look at the challenges being faced by end users, integrators, solution providers, the various use cases and customer deployments that the guys are seeing so far. We'll get some thoughts on what the outlook looks like this year and in the years ahead. And then finally, we'll have some audience questions at the end. So for our first topic of discussion, what are some of the key drivers you are seeing? And let's start with Richard, if I may.
Sure, and welcome and thanks for having me today. Without a doubt, right now, the greatest driver for use and deployment of LTE, and for that matter, any other wireless approach, is the pandemic. The greatest amount of demand, I think, perhaps in the history of the wireless industry is upon us. And over the past year, we've noted a very consistent level of demand. And among the tools that are being used to reach out to areas of great need, especially in those areas where they are underserved or unserved, has been fixed wireless access. And among the tools, of course, of fixed wireless access are LTE and OnGo resources. We see this as an ideal time for the new standards and the old standards to provide services to meet the ever-flowing demand from the pandemic. So that's where we'll kick it off, is that the demand is very high, and to meet those demands, we've got the tools that are necessary.
Thanks for that, Richard. How about you, David? What do you think are some of the key drivers?
Hey, thanks for having me. So if you look at the worst part of the digital divide, a lot of this is very much non-line of sight. And so in traditional WISP sense, there's very little spectrum that's available. And of course, CBRS has opened up a vast amount of spectrum for both PAL holders who have paid for special access and for non-PAL holders for GAA access. And so the ability to reach that last mile, the few houses that fiber isn't necessarily a great option for, this new LTE, using LTE for CBRS has been a fantastic driver to non-line of sight deployments.
Great stuff. Thanks, David. And Jim, what are your thoughts on the key drivers?
Well, I'm kind of looking at this from a private network perspective, with fixed wireless being an application or a use case inside of private networks. And the way I've seen this from the very beginning is the key driver is the business case with the underlying ROI to justify what you're doing. And then most recently, beginning in 2020 with some federal funding available, it's actually that federal money and grants that have been the key drivers to a lot of the acceleration that we're seeing. And I think what if you talk about a pure WISP thing, I think the key driver has been, the government telling you got to move from Part 90 to Part 96. So I think all of those are in play right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then what are the kind of challenges that need to be addressed when deploying private LTE and OnGo? Jim, let's start with you on this one. And I'm just going to bring this one up here. You've outlined some areas earlier when we were discussing this. Could you quickly talk us through some of these key challenges and how they can be addressed?
Yeah, so these key challenges really kind of relate more to the enterprise and to the let's say the government kind of entity that wants to bring in some sort of service. If you're a straight WISP, and you're worried about your operations, I mean, I think the supply issue and getting access to fiber and stuff would be on top of the list. But let's say you're a school or you're a city and you want to take advantage of all this for a private network. You need a lot of things that you don't have the headcount for, the expertise for. And so these are some of the important, often overlooked elements that need to come into play in order to, create a robust and reliable network and the support network to make it happen. And like I said, if you listen to a lot of webinars, they talk about, stuff like Druid EPCs and radios and away you go, but you need to take care of this stuff too, is the message.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that makes it easier for the end user, I think. David, what are your thoughts on the challenges? You've got a lot of, frontline experience, I guess.
Sure. And I agree with James on from the enterprise side of things. There is a lot to a 4G network. And so getting a partner that has either manages it for you, which is a service that's definitely up and coming and ongoing out there. If you're going to try to bring it in-house, then proper training, good partners such as Druid, somebody that can help bring you from absolutely no knowledge of LTE and how to deploy it to at least in operational knowledge is very key to moving into the LTE space.
Absolutely. And Richard, how about you? What are your thoughts on the challenges?
Sure. There are obviously more and more challenges with the sophistication of 4G and private networks and the oncoming 5G and NR solutions that are coming our way. But traditional WISPs use a blend of different types of network deployments. And to meet the immediate needs, a lot of them are using very simple or much more simple 4G networks in their deployments to meet residential, small business, and industrial needs, especially in the unserved and underserved areas where they're using point-to-point, point-to-multi-point solutions. They may have a mobile component to them, or they may not include the mobile component. And if they don't include the mobile component, then they don't need as much of the back end, the core and some of the more sophisticated things that are required in a full-scale carrier style network. And the advantage of that is they can do their deployments very rapidly, and they can use different components, different types of network aspects in their deployment, making their deployments a lot more pliable and flexible to work in different areas. As Jim said earlier, a lot of the deployments that fixed wireless people do, and David said the same thing, require line of sight if you're using microwave. Well, the way you get around pure line of sight is that you use fiber in some areas, Ethernet in other areas, and a combination of frequencies and spectrums to do your delivery for your last mile where it makes sense. And WISPs see the challenge in getting access to resources to be able to put their radios up where they need to be put, just like every other carrier, having access for fiber and to get into those hard to meet places. But they've been doing it for 20 years and the challenge is met.
Great stuff. All very good points. Thanks, James. So one of my favorite topics are the use cases, the customer deployments. Let's see. So Jim, can you tell us a bit about the homework gap and how this is being addressed? And then on the next slide, it broadens out into some other areas that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so this homework gap use case, or the digital divide or virtual learning, is something that certainly wasn't on our radar at this time last year. But because of the virtual learning, it didn't create a use case for this, but it accelerated the need to address this use case. And the use case is there are certainly a giant number of students and households that don't have sufficient enough broadband to do homework, and certainly not to do virtual learning in the classroom environment that exists today. So a good number of schools took advantage of the federal COVID money available and created their own private wireless network. Sometimes they partnered with a carrier or WISP to do this. But when the school was involved, and situations varied, the typical experience was, I don't want to be responsible for installing a fixed wireless terminal on the side of an apartment or a house. I want to give a student, a Google Chromebook or a Windows device, and I want to enable a hotspot for them to do this sort of thing. And so the three devices you see on the right, a home gateway product, a dongle, a MiFi device, that typically talk CBS or EBS band on the one side, then create a Wi-Fi hotspot on the other, was the kind of opt-in method of choice. And then when you get into rural environments where you may have students that are really, really far away from being able to get coverage, you create these hotspot type places where students can go to, and a lot of times they're a school bus, so you put a router that accommodates more capacity than what you see on the right, and typically it's done via CBRS, and you create that hotspot in a little bit different formula than you would for the at-home use case. But that's what these are all about. Again, it's something that accelerated tremendously because of COVID, and your large number of schools across the U.S. are trying to resolve this homework gap.
Sure. And then there's some other cases here if you want to cover them.
Yeah. So
quickly.
So this is really an interesting development, and the interesting development is schools and cities and communities are now getting together, and they're basically combining efforts to not only resolve this homework gap, but to create a better wireless environment for their community. And what you see here is kind of a potpourri of use cases for the smart city or the smart community environment. And this is happening both rural and semi-urban, urban, suburban, you name it. This is to me the most exciting thing happening in the CBRS domain at the moment. And there are, you have to resolve that first use case, which is a student who has to do homework in a virtual environment or learn in a virtual environment. But if you do this right, and I think Richard mentioned it, you design this to be a carrier class mobile network with a core, you basically have your own cellular 5G network where you can start, creating automated traffic. You can create a transportation network that's more efficient. You can create more Wi-Fi hotspots in places that were too expensive to create fiber links to and cable links. You can swap out the mobile data terminals in your police vehicles and your tablets for city workers. You can do IoT for pool temperatures for public swimming and all kinds of stuff. And to me, this is the story of 2021, and it's why you may look at this as more than a pure fixed WISP play. It's a smart city play that's happening right now. And in rural environments, it often is including the utility, who is a utility co-op, let's say, that wants to be part of this.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that, Jim, that I think even getting out of the municipal side of this, we're seeing the vertical markets for extension of these things into all kinds of unusual and exciting areas, precision agriculture, dairy measurement, parking space monitoring, things that were typically IoT or industrial IoT, formerly known as SCADA approach things are falling into this. Industrial uses in manufacturing, lifestyle stuff. The combination of the work at home with the student at home, creates this little node need everywhere. And the great part of all this, as Jim was noting, is one, it's rapidly deployed. It's not wildly expensive, and it gets this great panoply of uses. And as I think that's the great thing about CBRS and some of the other bands that are involved in this. You start out with something small, someone sees the advantage that they can do with something and they create something else, and then they create something else, and the use cases in telemedicine and in agriculture and in energy and in security and surveillance and so forth, it just begins to really self-multiply. And of course that demand hasn't changed, it just keeps on going up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's why it's so important, to show people the use cases, because as you say, they think of other uses when they see them. Absolutely. And
part of the story here is that, and Richard probably knows this, that if you talk to community leaders, whether they be a CIO of a city, of a mayor of a town, they all had this vision of creating something like this, but they could never get the business case over the line. Well, along comes federal money and grants to resolve this underlying homework gap, and you now have that business case issue.
Exactly. The money is there, and everybody's interested when that's the case. Absolutely. I mean, we've been doing this a long time in Europe, as you know, Jim, and the business case could often be a blocker, but that's it's a bit of game changer really in the last year or two. As Richard said, it's all about getting that coverage rapidly out there now. It needs to happen immediately, especially in the primary discussion today around the digital divide. Just switching to you, David. I'm just bringing up here a case study we've put together around the projects we've been doing with Airspan and guys like that with OnGo. There's utilities here in education, but just to give you an opportunity, I know you're out there in the fields, ultimately, and just be interested in getting your feedback on the use case and customer deployments you're seeing.
I mean, honestly, it's very similar to what the other guys have been talking about. I mean, the primary driver is, of course, started with the school kids, and it's been one of some of my proudest moments last quarter to help people get hundreds upon thousands of kids online. So that's been fantastic. But because I mean, remember we started with literally ISPs calling me up wanting to put in a hotspot in a parking lot because nobody could get their child online. And now we're putting in vast networks of vast networks basically just to get those kids online. And so we're building out whole new infrastructure based on the fact that we have accessible spectrum, the ability for that spectrum to be managed properly and to be accessible at any level, from whether it's a carrier needing PAL licenses and have bought PAL licenses, or the next market I've heard coming out of the SaaS is going to be rental of PAL licenses in certain areas. There were people that literally purchased PAL licenses for the purpose of renting them back out once this became popular. So there's some fantastic new use cases that are being generated that we don't even know where this year's going to go at this point.
I can speak a little bit to that, David.
Sure.
I run the committee in the Wireless Innovation Forum, the standards development organization that does CBRS, and we're working very heavily on the post assignment of PAL spectrum on the secondary market, and that's what you're referring to, the rental and
Absolutely.
leasing portion of it. And the idea of that is to allow those counties and PALs that were purchased in areas that either a larger provider or a WISP or whoever has purchased that isn't going to use, to make the most efficient use of that area. Either it defaults to GAA and it can be used by a network as a license by rule approach, or it can be leased or disaggregated, and smaller portions of the PAL can either be leased out for a short period of time or a long period of time, making the system quite flexible to the array of needs.
Absolutely. And
that's really interesting, guys. Go ahead, David. Yeah, please.
Well, I was just going to point out, to tie back into one of the other slides and questions that we had about the complexity. Just working with the Druid guys, I have for the last year. Some of the new platforms that are coming out, such as the Ramus platform by Druid Software, it's designed more like a network and less like a standard 3GPP core. 3GPP cores are vastly complex beasts, which require basically a couple networking guys minimum just to get one off the ground, versus something more in the network style space. So it's been fantastic seeing the new innovations coming out.
Thanks, David. Yeah, we've I suppose we started delivering to enterprise a long time ago. So we were always thinking about, even before fixed wireless access and LTE, giving the IT manager that ease and capability to be able to run a network and configure it. But that's great commentary. And interestingly enough, on the PAL licenses versus GAA as well, when we look in Europe, I suppose you could call a lot of the spectrum in the Netherlands and the UK historically was more general availability, and that has worked really well. Like, we've hundreds of business critical and mission critical sites, hospitals, manufacturing plants. They're running on, you could call, dedicated spectrum, shared spectrum, but it's more of a general availability. It's kind of, there is an agreement there is an engagement between the license holders. So it's really interesting to see what's happening in the US now with priority access and that rental model you mentioned, Richard. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how things are evolving.
Yeah, I mean, there'll
Jim,
be over 100. There'll be over 100
go ahead,
megahertz.
Richard.
I was just gonna say there's over 100 megahertz of spectrum available in GAA, 70 of which is dedicated and 30 of which sort of moves around based upon where PALs are located. And so there's the strong availability for someone who doesn't have a lot of money to set up a network to use these almost licensed cost-free approaches. They're not cost-free. You still have to use a SaaS and you still have other things you have to do, but they're far less than buying a license. And that does provide a very unique opportunity through CBRS.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim, I've got a few additional ones here that are out in the public domain. If you want to, we're doing pretty well for time, I think. So if you want to speak to them, the first one I think is pretty well known out there. It's one of the first ones, I think, a few years ago. American Dream Entertainment and Retail Complex in New Jersey. Do you want to talk around the use case in this? It's data use, video, IoT sensors.
This one got a lot of publicity, and it was a kind of a prime example of pre-COVID use cases, creating a ability to not only solve, neutral host or, cellular usage inside the mall, but they had in order to open the mall, they had to come to agreement with the Meadowlands during football Sundays when the Giants and Jets played across the parking lot. They didn't want the mall people creating havoc with traffic. So the initial use case was really a fixed wireless use case, and that was this digital signage that was involved in traffic, saying, hey, go here, go there. You can use the American Dream Mall for parking. That was really the initial use case that started this whole thing. And ironically, it was a combination of CBRS, and because we're a carrier with roaming agreements, some of them we had to use roaming for in order to solve this. As the mall's starting to open back up, not only will the neutral host use case play out, but you'll see private networks kind of put in place to offload where, you might say Wi-Fi isn't good enough, and that would be for point of sale, for perhaps replacing landline PBXs inside some of the stores, so they can just bring their iPhone or their Android device and use that as a phone for the store, and several other peripheral use cases off that. But this is a victim of COVID as far as acceleration of a lot of
Sure.
this.
Yeah. Hopefully it'll come back. Yeah, no doubt it will come back, but absolutely, I take the point. And I found it fascinating as well, the direction they were going in terms of entertainment and retail, and as a new model, for all of that as well, where they'd mixed, ski slopes and real, they've been looking at what families do together now, and then mixing high-end brands in that kind of environment, because people had already been buying online.
Yeah, they don't even like to call it a retail venue, because it has indoor ski slope, all kinds of activities. So I think they call it an experience center. And there are plans to open others, but obviously with COVID, those plans kind of got delayed a little bit.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then the next one was the Seven Cedars Hotel campus and casino, another really interesting one. Out in a rural location, I guess, where you're improving guest and staff experience.
This one is out really, really far away from everything, but it's an example of a casino that had very poor cellular coverage inside the facility. And if you're a casino operator, you don't want people leaving the gaming table to go outside to make telephone calls. And then they also they have a loyalty app, and they want to be able to message with their high rollers and that sort of thing, and they couldn't if you didn't have cell phone coverage. So you need to resolve that. Plus, there was all kinds of back of house initiatives for housekeeping. When you get in the casino business, you need to have your devices and tablets controlled by your policy. So all that is in play. And then some of the really cool futuristic things that I think are going to happen with gaming is related to gambling from your cell phone, and being able to create geofences and experiences directly from your cell phone if you're within proximity of a legal place to do that. So there's all kinds of future stuff coming down the line, and this is on a tribal location, so it's tribal gaming.
Very good. Thanks for that, Jim. Richard, just before we leave this topic, have you anything you'd like to add on the use case and customer deployment side?
Yeah, as I said earlier, WISPs are sort of venturing into a lot of different uses. Hospitality is very high on that list, and a lot of it is forward-looking, because we've sort of had a pause in that industry for the past 9 months or so. I think we can probably anticipate that as soon as things turn around, there's going to be sort of a whiplash where people are probably going to be using hospitality a lot more, and even more so than they did before the pandemic. WISPs are very active in providing solutions in hospitality, in casinos, in private farms and locations in rural areas. we see an awful lot of agricultural deployments at this point. So yes, the vertical marketplace is the place. And it's incredible how with solutions very much like what Geoverse is doing and others, the ability to provide customized solutions is really upon us. And I think with neutral host coming, and it's sort of in its infancy right now, but with neutral host coming, the ability to take several carriers, blend them together with one set of equipment or through a uniform equipment deployment, that will also provide great amounts of flexibility, especially in hospitality.
Absolutely. Agreed. And Dave, before we leave the topic, it just struck me there, you've been bringing back a lot of, multi-site or MEC, that kind of local data breakout or, distributed model in terms of, customer deployment type. You seem to be seeing quite a bit of that out there.
Yeah, so some of the WISP and some of the even brand new initiatives that are just building brand new WISP just because they've partnered with schools and with counties and states. The ability for them to try to backhaul this into one central location is really problematic, especially in some of the divides that we're talking about. There may be a POP 300 miles away, and the fiber to tie in a local site 300 miles away could be in the thousands upon thousands of dollars beyond your budget. That 30 to 50 to 100 subscribers wouldn't ever pay for it. So leveraging a MEC or mobile edge computing allows you to have a centralized spot for your HSS, for your authentication, for your monitoring, with local breakout, allowing you to leverage the local bandwidth available to you at that point. And so we see a lot of that happening right now. My expectation is that's going to explode in the next quarter or two.
Yeah, sure, same here, yeah. Once they move beyond the concept of one site, it's the natural next question, I think, how do we do this elsewhere? And then how do we manage all of those, Very good, guys, thank you for that.
And just to throw in there real quick, MEC is actually a heavy duty component of 5G. And so once you start deploying a MEC style deployment, you're on your way to working into a more 5G centric scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. That roadmap to 5G, I think, is really important as well. They need to know, that it's there and it is easily achievable.
Absolutely.
So, guys, moving on to the final topic. Get your crystal balls ready, I suppose. Yeah. What does the outlook look like for this year and beyond, really? And David, I'll start with you this time, if I may. Get your thoughts.
Sure. Honestly, we've got a whole lot of work ahead. We thought everyone thought when the Q2 or Q3 and Q4 of last year hit that this would all end, that the money would end at the end of the year, and we're in phase 2 of COVID funding. We're in phase 2 of literally, and I brought this out to people when they all started telling me, oh, it's going to stop, the funding's going to stop, they're only going to do this once. Well, so how do you, as if you're one rural community that didn't happen to get any funding last year, and so your kids aren't going to have distance learning available to them, but the county over, those guys happen to get on top of the funding, and so now what are you going to do? Well, of course, you're in politics. You're going to call all the people in, start calling in favors, start beating up your representatives, and here we are at round 2, and round 2 is looking to be 4 to 5 times what round 1 was at this point.
Wow, really interesting. Thanks for that, David. Richard, how about you?
Yep, positive outlook. I mean, it's funny to come off of something as horrible as this past year and taking a look at the environment the way it's been. But to be honest with you, I don't think employers are going to go back to the same thing that they had before. They have the opportunity to use people in places where the costs aren't as high, don't need as much office space. Things are more done in real time. Same thing with schools. It gives them the flexibility to continue at least an aspect of the virtual education that they've brought on before. If they have to go back to it, they can do it rapidly. And plus having the ability to go back to it that way is a true advantage because they didn't have that experience before. In disaster scenarios, this is one we haven't talked about, but in disaster scenarios where you have hurricanes or earthquakes or fires, and all of which the United States sees a lot of, the response time with fixed wireless and these approaches are very rapid. If there's destruction of infrastructure, it can be put back up rather rapidly, which means that the outlook is good there too. So you're going to see, I believe you're going to see a continuation in the employment space. You're going to see the continuation in the vertical market space, certainly with education, and in the response and continued need in the disaster space as well, all of which are positive for this.
A great point. We didn't think of public protection disaster relief yet, but absolutely. I'd forgotten about my climate anxiety, to be honest with you. COVID has distracted me in the last year or so, but absolutely, we were building NIBs, years ago in 4G for fire services and for various parties where they could set up those networks quickly, as you say, and you could run drones off of them, push to talk, body-worn camera technology, fixed point cameras. Yeah, absolutely. So that's another really interesting area. Jim, over to you. How's your crystal ball looking?
Yeah, well, I have a crystal ball for 2022 and then another crystal ball, which is kind of like guessing stuff. But if you're looking at kind of 2022 crystal ball, obviously this trend of resolving the homework gap continues. But as I said, the movement of cities and school districts getting along, which typically, you probably don't realize this, they didn't normally get along. So this is starting to happen, I think, because of the digital divide, and those movements to the smart community network, smart city networks start to accelerate, and you're going to start reading more and more about that in press releases coming up. And like I said, this is happening in medium, small, big towns all over the US. And then also you start seeing, smart factory, smart ag, things like that, smart warehousing come to the picture using these private networks. And then one of the use case that everybody is kind of crying for, which is more appropriate for in-building, is neutral host. And I think once you look out to 2022 and beyond, you start, and in-building starts becoming more traffic, more populated. I think you'll start seeing the use case where you're just using CBRS for neutral host. And so that will unlock a giant kind of portion of the enterprise that where you just couldn't afford it with DAS, and now you have a solution where the economics make sense, and that will be the story beginning sometime in 2022.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as long as I've been in this business, when people have a cellular handset in their hand, they just assume they can get on the public network, and whatever network they're with, they want to be on that network. So yeah, absolutely. Just in terms of 5G, guys, before we leave this topic, I mean, I think we all probably know how that is evolving. The products and capabilities are evolving there, but we saw a lot of action, I guess, in 2020 in that space as well, and COVID probably helped to some extent, where governments in the UK and Germany looked inward and invested and innovated and continue to do so. Any one of you got a particular view on that? In terms of the US market, I get it. Private 4G, it's a rich ecosystem for CBRS and OnGo, and why wouldn't you hit the ground running with those devices? But what are your thoughts on 5G outlook?
So we're already seeing, we're already seeing quite a bit of 5G products starting to hit the market. The RDOF funds are requiring a gigabit of throughput, or at least that's the target for RDOF, is trying to get a gigabit. And on a standard 20 megahertz or even 8CA carrier aggregation, you would need a vast amount of spectrum. And in order to get that, 5G has opened up frequencies. Of course, they're a lot less line of sight. They're more small cell. But that is the future for trying to bring out internet. So your inner cities are going to get it first, and then tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 are already starting to roll out with that sort of scenarios. So that's definitely the next phase of this.
Definitely, definitely. And as we said earlier, people investing in 4G today, they just want to know that roadmap is there, and it's an easy one, you know. Great, guys. Lucy, I will hand back to you for questions from the audience.
Great, thank you. Just a reminder to audience members, please submit questions. We've had some come in so far, so we're going to jump right in. Our first question: are fixed wireless access deployments being used in rural and suburban environments to reduce areas that are not served or insufficiently served?
I can certainly take that one to begin with. That's the fundamental deployment way for covering those areas. For the past almost 17 years, WISPs have come into areas that were not covered and brought signal from very, very far away. Very often started out as just a need. You, your neighbor, your next door neighbor, and so forth didn't have the ability to get anything, and you wanted something, and so they put together somewhat of a club or a small group to bring in those services, and all of a sudden it becomes apparent that there's a business there. The other guys want it around your area, and it expands. Without a doubt, fixed wireless, both in its prior iterations and in its really expanded iterations, whether it's in 5G or LTE, or it's in proprietary air interfaces, or it's done in some hybrid of fiber and microwave, the solution is exceptionally well suited for that. And I think you're going to see a greater diversity of things. We used to over 2,500 WISPs across the United States had previously just brought the signal to the point of demarcation at a business or a residence. Now they do all sorts of other things that add into that, whether they create private networks, or they do security and surveillance, or they bring the networks in for Wi-Fi or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. The answer to that question is a big check.
Yeah,
Great.
so I mean, even from going on the road, I was on the road for most of last quarter, and I was in areas helping CBRS airspan in particular deployments in areas that I had absolutely no cell phone service or spotty cell phone service. So you know, trying to get anything beyond DSL in those sorts of forms, and even worse, mostly satellite is what's available. So absolutely, this is the primary use case for that.
Great, thank you. Our next question. So I see that GeoVerse was nominated for an OnGo award for their carrier/MNO service for virtual learning on the Navajo Nation. Can you give us a little bit more about that?
I assume that's for me, Lucy. Yeah, so GeoVerse is a legacy CCA carrier. We're a part of a telecom holding company's group, ATN International. And so the companies ComNet and Choice Wireless and now GeoVerse are all combined into one, about to be all renamed GeoVerse. But one of our service areas includes the Navajo Nation. And so when COVID hit, the Navajo Nation was probably the most hardest hit area as far as, you know, how many percentage of the population it affected. And they got a significant amount of money to help them through that. And they, as the carrier for them, we ended up building 108 new cell sites, primarily directed at providing virtual learning, not only for students that attended school on the reservation in the various school districts there, but a good percentage of the students actually went off the reservation to boarding schools where they actually lived during the school year. So you took in curriculum from towns like Holbrook, Arizona, Page, Arizona, and now you had to deliver that to the households, or as close to the households as you can get. So we used a combination of CBRS spectrum, our licensed spectrum, and EBS spectrum to do this, and created a separate private network to enable this. So it's been something that's been very successful, and you have to do this at zero to little cost to the end user. So the only way to do that is to take advantage of the federal funding that was available.
Great, thanks. I see we are come up on the 45-minute mark. So we'll just get to one last question before we close out today. So our last question is, what are some of the advantages of deploying fixed wireless solutions?
So if you don't mind, I'll take that one. So the advantage of trying to deploy more of a fixed wireless solution is trying to get into a truly mobile scenario is highly complex and takes a huge amounts of resources, interconnections with carriers and those sorts of things. And I'm sure James knows those sorts of things as well. I mean, he's done the tie-in from private and public, so fixed wireless allows you to just essentially do that last mile connection on a per home or per business basis. And typically installations are between an hour and 3 hours worth of manpower to bring somebody online that might be 7 to 10 miles away from the nearest internet connection. So fixed wireless has been the answer since I've been in wireless for about 20 years now, and continues to go for as long as we have people in the middle of nowhere. You'll see fixed wireless.
Yeah, I'll second that motion. I'll second that motion. If you look at the geography of the United States and you take away the coastal areas of the United States, you end up with a good portion of the United States that is exactly that kind of layout where there's nothing close by. And so that's where fixed wireless shines very heavily. It does serve those areas exceptionally.
And I was just going to add to David's point, just slightly there, Lucy, as well. So when you're deploying in the home, the ability to be able to prioritize devices within the home, then like my situation today on this call, I've got kids chomping at the bit to get back on their Xboxes and chew up that bandwidth or YouTube streams, etc. So we were working with Dave, Jim, and the guys we call it enterprise slicing, but basically to be able to group devices. Let's say it's my laptop right now while I'm doing this important work, and to give that priority on my broadband in the home, and then the other devices are on silver, let's say, and bronze. So that's another advantage. That doesn't exist in the Wi-Fi I have in my home in Ireland, for example. But you can do that on OnGo. You can get coverage quickly out of the areas where it isn't, and then you can actually prioritize the devices within that home, in addition to that.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for today's discussion. We hit on some really important parts, important topics, that is. Does anyone have any final thoughts before we close out today's webinar? Great. Well, thank you all again very much. Thank you to Druid for sponsoring, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day. Thanks and goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.